So now I'm going to dive straight into my introduction and we are going to take it from there. Here we go. Hi, I'm Tyson Franklin and welcome to this week's episode of the Podiatry Legends podcast. The podcast designed to help you feel, see and think differently about the podiatry profession. With me today is Dr. Frances Henshaw, and we are going to talk about a topic that most people know that makes me a little bit uncomfortable. We're going to talk about wounds and a few other things in that particular area. And I have an expert on with me. Frances, how are you doing today?
Hi, Tyson. I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad we came across each other on LinkedIn. That's how we met.
Oh, I stalk a lot of people on LinkedIn, Tyson.
And you were telling me about your career, in the first message. And you said, I've had an interesting career. And I read through it. I went, what an interesting career. We need to share your career on the Podiatry Legends podcast, because I love people that have not just come into podiatry and just put blinkers on and done one thing. They've branched out, they've done different things for different reasons. And I think there's a lot of people coming in the profession. I want them to know that the world is their oyster. So give us a little bit about the Frances story. How did you get into podiatry in the first place?
Well, it's funny you should ask that, Tyson. When I was young, I wanted to be a podiatrist. I think I like kind of picking at things and getting splinters out. My parents thought it was really odd. So they actually sent me up to London to have all this career analysis done. They spent a fortune and it came back saying that I shouldn't be a podiatrist.
Why?
But I decided that I would defy everybody and become a podiatrist anyway. So I did my podiatry, and then the only place I could get a job when I finished was in a really deprived part of London. And as you can tell from my accent, I'm British. Yeah. And so I was basically from day one up to my eyeballs in diabetic foot ulcers. And I really didn't know what I was doing. And it was a very steep learning curve. And then after a couple of years of that, I decided to come to Australia. And all I wanted to do in Australia was work in a bar, because I thought that would be really fun. But I got to Australia and there was a big shortage of podiatrists. So then I realized that I could earn a lot more money being a podiatrist than working in a bar. So
you weren't coming over here to work as a podiatrist initially, you were coming over like a backpacker to work in bars and pubs.
I just wanted to have fun. Yeah. And but I happened to be a podiatrist.
Okay, can I go back a step though?
Sure.
When you said that you always wanted to be a podiatrist, what exposure had you had to podiatry that made you think this was a career that you're going to enjoy?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because the answer is absolutely nothing. I'd never been to a podiatrist. I didn't know anyone who had been to a podiatrist. My mum probably needed to see a podiatrist because she had horrific corns, but I think she used to get them out herself with a razor blade or something dreadful. We have had words about that subsequently. She doesn't do it anymore. But no, I think that I went through the book of careers that you could have. And the thing that I love about podiatry actually is it has this degree of autonomy. So there's lots of different career choices. I've worked in private practice. I've worked in public hospitals. I've worked overseas on aid projects. I've worked in different countries. I've worked with homeless people. And I think that you have lots of different opportunities, which makes it very interesting. And I also think as a podiatrist, you're kind of part of many different teams, for example, in a hospital, which is good because you interact with a lot of other health professionals, but you also avoid a lot of the politics a lot of the time because you're not stuck on a ward with, a load of the same people all the time. You just kind of pop in and out when they need you.
So what was it about ulcers that floated your boat? Was it the first time you saw one, you went, this is, because I know the first time I saw one, I dry reached and I'd still have that reaction. Just the smell gets to me. What did you love about it?
Well, I think it was more that I got a job that I just had to look at foot ulcers because that was a massive part of my caseload. So by default, I became, I suppose, an expert. So in the UK, I worked in a team of about 40 podiatrists. So I had a lot of mentors there who could help me to understand how to look after foot ulcers. And then I got to Australia and they didn't seem to have this expertise. So, this is when I realized that, I was better off working as a podiatrist than working in a bar.
Which part of Australia did you end up in first?
Well, I ended up in Sydney and I landed in Bondi, and then I went on a little trip up the coast in a boat. Actually, I crewed for somebody on a yacht, and then I was supposed to go back to England because I was only coming out for 3 months. And then on this boat, I thought, this is ridiculous. Why would I want to go back to London in, where the weather's miserable? So I flew back to Sydney and I just basically went through the yellow pages to find myself another job. And I got one in Manly, luckily. So I ended up working in Manly by the beach in Sydney. And it was very nice. And then I also worked in a hospital.
So from that progression there, you mentioned that you did have your own business for a period of time.
Yeah. So I worked for somebody in Manly, and then I got an opportunity from a friend of a friend who was a physiotherapist to rent some rooms. So I took the plunge. I think my first week I had the grand total of one patient.
That's a good start.
And I just did it 2 days a week. I worked in a public hospital the rest of the time, and I gradually built up this practice. And then I actually started another practice as well. So in the end, I had 2 practices. I was exceptionally busy, and I was seeing a whole variety of foot problems, but I always kept my public hospital job for half or 1 day a week, just so I could keep my hand in with the diabetic foot ulcers. And you asked me why I like them, and I have grown to like them now. And do you know why I like them? I think it's because you've got something to see. You know, as a podiatrist, I hate it when someone comes in with heel pain, because there's nothing to look at, and you're like poking and prodding, and all the evidence suggests that you shouldn't go and send them for lots of expensive scans until you've actually looked through a lot of other possibilities first. And it can be quite a slow process, whereas if someone's got a gaping hole in their foot, it's actually not so difficult to figure out exactly what's going on. So I like the detective work of foot ulcers.
Plus, you visually, you can see if things are improving. Each time they come back and see you, you can see improvement in the ulcer. You know that you're doing your job.
Absolutely. And you know, we have lots of high-level wound photography and imaging systems now that can really keep tabs on that. And of course, on the converse side, you can also see when people are going backwards, and some people do go backwards very rapidly, and then you need to reevaluate what you're doing and take a new course of action.
Okay, so you had such an interest in this particular area that you decided to go and do a PhD.
I guess it was born of frustration, Tyson, because despite my best efforts, and I tried really hard, a lot of these wounds weren't healing. And I thought, oh, there's got to be a way to help get these wounds to heal. And I happened to have done some aid work in a little island in the Pacific called Kiribati with an endocrinologist who was head of the diabetes research in a big hospital, and he was attached to Sydney University. So I thought I'd be really altruistic and offer myself as you know, to do a PhD. And he was very, very kind, and he took me on. And it's quite funny because when he took me on, he said to me, he said, Frances, I know what's going to happen here. He said, you'll probably rush through and make some mistakes, but I want you because I know that you'll get stuff done. And I was like really quite indignant. I was like, you know, he's telling me that I'm a cowboy, but it was actually it was a really, really accurate assessment of me, because he actually gave me a project that was in a biochemistry lab. And when you make a little mistake in a biochemistry lab, it is quite catastrophic most of the time. So because I hadn't really worked in a biochemistry lab, it was a very steep learning curve. I did make lots of mistakes, but I did get something done in the end. But at the end of it, I have to say, it will be a cold day in hell when I ever go back into a biochemistry lab to work, because it's really not my scene. It made me realize that I'm much better off with patients, Tyson, than cells and Petri dishes and test tubes.
So how long did it take you to do the PhD in that area?
It took me about 7.5 years. So half of it was in a lab, but I ended up with this really amazing skill set, I suppose, because some of it was done on patients, and some of the work was done in a biochemistry lab. So I kind of can really understand what happens in a wound microenvironment now at a more cellular level, and I can also translate that to solutions for patient care. And it's really good now when I have to read scientific papers and things like that, because I can actually go through them quite quickly. And probably when I started, if you gave me a basic science paper, it would have taken me about 2 days to read it, whereas now it'll probably take me 10 minutes.
Okay. So once you finished your PhD, what did you learn? What was the end result of doing a PhD that helped you more with wounds and healing ulcers? What was the biggest thing that you took away or that you brought back into a clinical situation?
Do you know what I really got from my PhD is this concept of personalized care, that it's not one size fits all. Yeah. And I think that what I realized is that, you know, we have all these evidence pieces and guidelines, and but you just really need to look at each person on their own. I also realized probably that there's so much that I don't know. And I was thinking, oh, you know, there's this highly inflammatory microenvironment in the wound. Maybe if we can dampen down this inflammation that's preventing foot ulcers from healing, we won't be able to make them heal. But after toiling away in the lab, looking at growth factors and matrix metalloproteinases and bacteria and honey and all these kind of things, I realized it was actually really far more complicated than I would ever be able to get my head around. And that's when I decided that perhaps I could contribute more by working as an academic.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, because once you did your PhD, you ended up at one of the universities as an academic. How did what you learned as a PhD translate then to being an academic and helping students?
Yeah, it's interesting because they really struggle sometimes to recruit academics in universities who can teach podiatry. And that's because they want people with PhDs, and PhDs in podiatry are rare as hen's teeth.
Yeah.
But I must say that a lot of what I did, I didn't really need a PhD for. Like if you're in a clinical situation with a student and a patient with a complicated foot ulcer, you'd probably be better off to have a clinician who knows a lot about diabetic foot ulcers rather than somebody who's gone straight from university and done a PhD and never actually clapped eyes on a foot ulcer before. So I guess that I was quite lucky because I did have, 15 years of clinical experience behind me. And I also had this problem solving ability that I think a PhD gives you. And a PhD really helps you to find solutions. You just become like a Googler on steroids, I suppose, because you just spend so much time trying to find information that you can get your hands on things really quickly.
So which university did you do the PhD through?
So I did my PhD at Sydney University, and then I went to Western Sydney University to work as an academic.
Did you enjoy it? Did you enjoy working with the students?
Look, it was a bit of a mixed bag.
I like that. It's not a yes or a no.
I guess if it was my absolute passion, I'd probably still be there.
Yeah.
I think that there was a lot of inherent challenges around things like sourcing placement for students. For example, they had to have 1,000 hours of placement. With the number of podiatrists in Australia, it was really, really hard. So you were often just putting out fires. And I think that when you've spent so much time doing a PhD, you've got this burning passion to do research. But in actual fact, you get very caught up with a lot of administrative tasks just running the podiatry program, which means it's very hard to do the research, which is one of the key reasons that you're there.
Yeah.
But that said, I really used to love watching my students develop. And I think one of the things that really did it for me was clinical reasoning, because to start with, all they wanted was facts, and more facts. And they were really into this rote learning, which I suppose perhaps is what they get at high school. But really, when you want to be successful in a clinical situation, you need to be able to synthesize information from blocks of information that you're given. And so I had this real problem-based learning approach. And, we've continued this in my new position at ConvaTec, because I think that it's a much more sticky way for people to learn. So rather than just giving them information and getting them to spit it out in an exam, it's give them a problem and help them learn to solve it.
Were you trying to get students to think?
I was.
Oh,
maybe that's why I got worn out.
How dare you? How dare you make them think?
No, but
I think it's great. I think it's great that you made them think.
Yeah, when they had those light bulb moments, Tyson, it was really very, very satisfying, because when you can teach someone how to think, they can solve a whole variety of problems.
Because I remember as a student, and sometimes I would ask one of the lecturers, why? We'd be told to do something, we'd be doing it a particular way. And I'd say, why? Why are we doing that? I don't quite understand. I know this is what we're told how to do something, but I don't quite understand why we're doing it. And sometimes their response was, because that's just the way it's done. And that used to irritate me sometimes, because I felt, are we supposed to think about it, or maybe challenge the way we're being taught sometimes?
Absolutely. And I think, I like being challenged by students. I think that nowadays we have this very much more evidence-based approach. So you should look at the best evidence to make your clinical decision. But that said, Tyson, it's very difficult sometimes when you're looking at these quite infrequently occurring problems that you see in podiatry, because there isn't a lot of evidence about how to treat certain conditions, even simple conditions like I don't know, bunion prevention. There probably isn't a lot of hard evidence that suggests that path A will prevent a bunion versus path B.
Yeah.
So then you are really out on a limb and making your own decision with the best evidence you have available. And that's where I think it's also very important to be very ethical in what you're doing, because sometimes it's easier to veer towards a path that, as a podiatrist, might pay a bit more of your mortgage off a bit more quickly. But I think we really need to look at the best available evidence. And, you know, I think I've often had to say to people, well, you know, this is only my expert opinion, my clinical opinion from my 15 years, I've seen it work. And that's not, for someone with a PhD, really what you want to be saying. You really want to be saying, well, actually, there's 3 systematic reviews that would agree that this is the right course of action. But in the absence of that, you got to do something, haven't you?
Oh, definitely. And so once you got into the university system, you were teaching the students on top of doing your PhD, that initial frustration you had about wounds not healing, did that improve over that 14-year period?
I think that the wound healing situation for people with diabetes really hasn't, unfortunately, changed that much. And I think that what I've learned to do is probably shift a lot of the focus more towards prevention.
Yeah.
Because once people have a foot ulcer, it's quite catastrophic, and, you know, the horse is bolted. Whereas if we can actually prevent that in the first place. So I guess if I'd stayed in academia, then that's probably what I would like to have pursued. You know, I think that, for example, offloading the high-risk foot is something that is key to preventing foot ulcers, but it's not necessarily done very well. You know, people give their patient an orthotic, but unless you're actually going to use some kind of an in-shoe pressure measurement, you're not really going to know whether your orthotic is fit for purpose.
Yeah.
And certainly we did a lot of work with ultrasound looking at the soft tissues of people with diabetes, and we know that they react very differently under stress and pressure. So it's very important that we do these things. So I think, yeah, prevention is really important. But I guess, having always worked in high-risk foot clinics, I've always seen people who have had foot ulcers. And I think, you know, in my current role, I really need to help to find ways that we can address these terrible problems in a way that will actually improve outcomes for patients.
So you went through being a clinician, having your own business, still working at the hospital, did your PhD, worked at the university, helping the students, which is great, giving back to the students, the young minds coming through. But then you jump ship and you're now in the corporate world working for, and I've got the name written down here, which I love this name, ConvaTec. And no, it is not a Samoan dance group.
No, it's not a Samoan dance group, but I do love the idea. And I've seen what happens at the international ConvaTec events, and it does look like a big dance party going on there. So
how did you end up at ConvaTec? So you're at the university. I take it you were happy working with the students. So did they approach you, or was there a job going, you went, oh, and you put your hand up for it?
Well, it was quite interesting, actually, because what happened is I was doing some work with Diabetes Australia, and they had a corporate partnership with ConvaTec. So I was introduced to the folk at ConvaTec. And to be honest, I was always very suspicious of corporates. You know, I thought, I have this altruistic job at a university, giving back, you know, giving my soul and my expertise to my students, doing research. And then when I started talking to ConvaTec, they basically have an ethos which is improving the lives of the people they touch. And they actually seem to practice it, which I found quite amazing for a corporate. And I met the vice president, and I met the business unit manager for wounds. And I was like, oh, I really would quite like to work with these people. And they rang me. They had a job going as a salesperson, but I was like, oh, I don't think I could do that. But I would like to work with them. So they basically said, well, we'd like to work with you. What would you like to do? And I'm really passionate about education. I'm really passionate about wounds. And I said, well, I just want everybody who has a wound to know that it will get well looked after. And to do this, we have to empower people to look after wounds well. And so I have a remit now at ConvaTec where, I don't have to sell things, but what I do is I make things like education series for healthcare practitioners.
Okay.
I do a lot of talks and things like that. And I help to upskill the sales team as well, so that they can give the right messages about our products. And like, for example, we have wound dressings that, not for all wounds, but for some wounds, you can leave them on for a week. And when we've got, for example, a situation where people can't get into hospital outpatient clinics as often, it's sometimes a good idea that healthcare practitioners know about these other pathways where perhaps a patient could leave a dressing on for a little bit longer.
So when they first approached you, though, they wanted you to be more of a sales rep, going out there and selling their product to different places. Is that what their initial intentions were? I think the thing was
is that we'd spoken, and one of the other reps had said to me, there's actually a job going. And I was like, oh, well, ConvaTec are a great company to work for, I would imagine. And the people I'd met had given me that indication. And so everyone was kind of encouraging me to apply for this job. But I just knew that for the experience I had, it probably wouldn't suit me. And I mean, but I think, it's a terrific pathway for people like podiatrists, medical devices companies, because it's a really interesting job. You really has a lot of autonomy, and you get to go out and talk to lots of different healthcare practitioners. So it's one of those things that never in a million years would I have thought that I would end up having a corporate job. But then I've done a lot of things in my career that never in a million years I thought I would do. So I guess I'm one of those people that says you don't need to stay in your lane. There is a big wide world for podiatrists. And certainly I know I had a student, and he was one of these students who was very exuberant and very extroverted. And he's got a job working, I think, for an orthopedic company doing, selling, I don't know, joint replacements or something like that. So I think that there is all these other strands to your bow when you're a podiatrist. And I think that that's what makes it such a good job and an exciting profession. And when you go to university, a lot of the time now, you come out with a qualification, but you don't actually come out with a job that you can do. Whereas when you do podiatry, you come out equipped to do a job. It doesn't mean that you have to do that job, because you've also learned how to talk to people, about anatomy and physiology, about different medical conditions. So you have to look at it as this really lovely, broad set of skills that you have as a podiatrist.
Yeah, well, I had met a few podiatrists over the years, the last 30 years or so, that did, when they finished, may work 1 or 2 years in a clinic and then worked for a shoe company for a number of years. Yeah. And they, like Adidas and Reebok, in different places where they worked for them, and they were on the road. They weren't just a sales rep, they were also there in an educational aspect as well, teaching, going into podiatry clinics and teaching not just about these are the new shoes, but just how their technology related to the patient. And nearly all the ones I knew that were doing it absolutely loved that they could take what they learned in podiatry, but then apply it to sport and running and other things that they really enjoyed.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the time when you commence a course at university, a lot of students are quite young and they perhaps have not really nailed down what they want in life. And I used to get students who'd say to me, oh, I'm really worried that I don't want to work as a podiatrist because, I'm not very confident at this or that, or I'm worried that I'm not going to get a job. And I'm like, You're not just a podiatrist, you have this broad skill set. And that's what is the beauty of doing this kind of training.
Richard Chasen would agree with that 100%. He's been on the podcast. I think the episode was, you're more than just a pod.
Oh, this could be you're more than just a pod too.
But it is, it's so much fun. And that's why when we connected on LinkedIn and I read through your profile and read some of the things that you did, it was so important just to expose this to, could be podiatrists have been out 5 or 10 years and they're thinking, I don't know if I want to be in a clinic. So instead of jumping ship and going to do a different profession, can you take the skill you've already got and apply it just in a different area of podiatry, or not just podiatry, but in a corporate area or to a company? Can you take that skill and maybe you can invent a position that didn't exist?
Well, that's pretty much what I did. And now,
Exactly what you did.
I kind of have the best of both worlds, because when I started teaching at the university, I probably wasn't very good at it. But by the end, I actually got about halfway through, I got a mentor in the UK. She was fantastic. And she really taught me lots about how to teach. So I guess now, I can apply that. And we have like really fun webinar series. The last one was called The Life of Brian. And it was about two old people who kept having problems and ulcers, and it was like a soap opera with a panel discussion. And now we have a podcast called The Wound Doctors. And
I was going to ask you about that. Oh, before you talk about the Wound Doctors, going back once about Life of Brian, did anyone throw in Life of Brian one-liners?
No, I don't think many people got the joke over here, actually.
But all I said was Jehovah, and then this piece of halibut was good enough for Jehovah. So if anyone has not seen the movie Life of Brian, I put it up there in a must-see movie list.
Yeah, so it's a fabulous film. And my boss is actually called Brian. So that's why I called the series The Life of Brian. And then we needed to have like some characters who are these old people. It was Brian and his wife called Sybil.
Yeah.
And so I used my mum and dad. And I used to make them like go to the park and roll around on the floor like they had hurt themselves and things like that. So it was quite funny. And it was even more funny when the audience would join in, and they'd be saying things like, I think that Sybil is a victim of spousal abuse. I think Sybil is incontinent. I think Brian has dementia, and all this stuff would be coming up. And I'd be saying, if only they knew that was my mum and dad, they might not be quite so quick to voice their comments. But it was very funny, and my parents thought it was hilarious because they actually have all their marbles and they're both continent as well.
Oh, that's even better. So this leads on to, you've started a podcast called The Wound Doctors.
Yeah.
How did that come about? What was the purpose behind doing that?
Well, it's funny because originally I wanted to do some podcasts for our sales team, because they need to learn about all the science and things in the sector, and they drive around all day. So it seemed like a no-brainer to give them a podcast. So I joined up with a podcast studio, and the guy who ran the studio he's really into golf. He knows nothing about wounds, but he was like, this is actually really interesting. And I didn't know that there was so much going on with wounds, and why don't people know this stuff? And where do people get their wound knowledge from? And I was like, well, podiatrists learn it at podiatry school, but a lot of other professions don't get a lot of wound knowledge. So I guess, at the moment you can do a day course, or you can do a master's of wounds, which would cost you more than $20,000 probably. But I think there's a whole lot of people who dabble in wounds. So for example, people in aged care or community nurses, and we just want something that can help them to learn a little bit more. And the same for podiatrists, for example. Like I've just had a request to do a podcast on how to look after wounds in private practice, because it's very difficult in Australia, where the funding model doesn't help to pay for the dressing. So, you can be going backwards. So all these kind of things we want to just put together to try and explain things in really simple terms with a few stories. We don't really want to, be sitting there with a pie chart and talking about p-values and boring everybody to death. So we just have a little discussion about different facets, and like the latest episode I think was on diabetic foot ulcers, and just explained a few key concepts and a few funny stories to illustrate them. So do you go in, so you said you go into a studio to do this. Is it a solo show, you talking, or do you bring a guest in and you talk about a particular I was the host. I was the host, Tyson, but I don't think I was as good as you. So I sacked myself after a couple of episodes. And I actually persuaded the chap who runs the podcast studio to become the host. So he's gone from a person who has 5 golf podcasts to now someone who has 5 golf podcasts and 1 wound podcast. So he's kind of the subject matter dummy who knows nothing about wounds. I'm probably the subject matter expert and co-host. And then we get another guest who we talk about various topics. So we had one about debridement the other day, and we also intersperse it with a few guests who will talk about, we call them the wound heroes, people who've either had wounds or people who've looked after a wound, to really showcase that with good care, wounds can heal. Because I think a lot of the time people who have wounds feel really hopeless. And I think people who look after wounds sometimes can feel hopeless as well, especially in places like aged care, where there's a lot of variability in care and people fighting over how you should look after a wound. And I think we just want to give people a bit of clarity and a little bit of hope to show them that wounds can heal and it's not all doom and gloom.
It is a very, very important part of podiatry, and wounds on feet definitely need to be looked after the right way, even though it doesn't suit everybody, me included, doing those sort of things. But I know there's a lot of podiatrists, I've got some close friends who are podiatrists that really love that area of podiatry. And so I think it's good. So from the corporate side of things, what you've learned being on that corporate side and the products that they actually have, that's the part that you're trying to educate podiatrists on what dressing to use for in what particular cases or a certain times.
I mean, in medical devices, it's a very heavily regulated industry. I mean, 20 years ago, everyone just, gave out pens, Post-it notes and whatever they wanted to. And all that is totally off the table now. It's highly regulated. So we have to provide education about our products. And we also have a remit where we can give more general education under kind of a different set of rules. So, whilst in our podcast, we might mention our products occasionally, that's not what it's about at all. I think we got to like episode 6 before anything got mentioned about ConvaTec, and I think that I'll start that again. So we got to about episode 6 before we even mentioned ConvaTec. So
no, that's okay. I heard that buzz in the background.
Yeah,
that might get edited out. It may not. It depends.
It's going to leave me to suffer and look like a rank amateur.
No, we're all.
I don't care.
We're all amateurs. No, I'll edit that part. It'll be in the video. That's why I always tell people, watch the video.
Edit me.
This is where all the mistakes are. I'll have a cough now on the video since it doesn't really matter. Oh my! So
at least nobody's sworn.
No, nobody has sworn yet, which has been fantastic. So I take it now. You came from the UK. I take it you're not going back to the UK.
I'm going back at Christmas, but only for
just
holiday.
For holidays, not to live. So what's next for Frances? What are you going to do in the future? Have you thought about you're going to stay with ConvaTec and you can see that progressing over the next 5-10 years, or do you see yourself getting back into research or pivoting in some other way?
Look, I'm really lucky. I actually have a conjoint position still at Western Sydney University, and I was actually just on the phone to them yesterday. I actually had a paper that I found out got published today with one of my PhD students. I had another paper that I'm submitting today. So I still very much have one foot in the academic camp, and I think that I'm very lucky working for ConvaTec that they see the value of that. They see the value of somebody keeping up their academic credibility. I also have a position at a public hospital, so I'm able to keep up with my clinical currency. And I think that's really important, because often people who at one point were an expert cease to be an expert because they haven't actually worked anywhere near the coalface for a while. So I think while these folk at ConvaTec are happy to, let me have this job that is probably 90% looking after their education and their profession and their clinical development, and we've got a product that's launching next year, so there's loads of exciting stuff around that. We've got to look at the evidence, we've got to talk to the sales team about how to present the evidence, we've got to see how it stacks up a bit against the competitors, and we have to be able to deal with objections from customers. So all that kind of stuff is something that I help with, but of course we have a massive global team that also does that, so I can't say that I do all the heavy lifting for ConvaTec.
You can't take all the credit for it.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that I'm lucky I had this greenfield job, and I still feel like I have an awful lot that I can contribute. So my to-do list just seems to get longer, and I guess if it starts to get shorter at one point, then maybe I'll look for the next challenge, but I can't see that happening in the foreseeable future.
Well, I'll guarantee you, anyone that's listening to this, anyone that's watching the video on YouTube, would have to pick up your enthusiasm in your voice. You're definitely not tired of what you're doing. So, which I think is great. You need to have that high energy. And yeah, you're probably one of the most excited people I've spoken to when it comes to wounds. So one final tip.
Because I've got no life, Tyson. All
You
I
got
do
no
is
life.
look at wounds.
But you also like hamburgers, you told me.
Do you know what? I came late in life to the hamburger because I used to be a vegetarian.
Oh my, didn't you miss out? People always say, what is it that I like about hamburgers? And to me, it's such an all-round meal. You get a bit of everything in there. And there's so much variety, so many variations that's why everywhere I go, I usually always have a hamburger.
Well, you're actually looking pretty well for a man who eats a lot of hamburgers. You don't seem to have got the Elvis Presley effect. So you obviously do a little bit of exercise as well, because, you know, as a person who's researched diabetes, we also have to be a little bit careful about what we eat. But at the same time, you can't start depriving people of anything. So I'd never tell anyone, even if they had diabetes, that they could never have a hamburger, because you've got to have a little of what you fancy that does you good. Yeah,
well, I wouldn't say I have a hamburger every week, but if I'm on holidays, if I was on a week's holiday, I might have a hamburger 3 times.
Oh, I thought you were a one-a-day man. The way
no. Maybe, like, say last weekend, I had 2 hamburgers over the weekend, 2 different places, 2 different chicken burgers to see what they were like. One was quite good, one was quite bad.
Oh, I've never had a chicken burger. I haven't gone that far.
Yeah, I don't normally have chicken burgers. I like to just stick with the beef burger myself. But yeah, maybe once a fortnight or something, I'll have a burger. So it's not all the time, unless I'm traveling and I see a new burger place and I'll go, oh, I have to go and check that out. So
shall I tell you another of my dirty secrets, apart from coming late to the hamburger world?
Yeah.
I ate Vegemite toast for the first time ever yesterday, and I've lived in Australia for 23 years.
Well, you haven't missed anything. I'm not a fan of Vegemite. Have you tried Promite?
Oh, no, I haven't.
Oh, my God. Promite will change your life. Oh. Promite, it looks exactly the same, except Vegemite is a yeast extract and Promite is a vegetable extract. And Promite is sweeter and is fantastic. So most people will be in the Vegemite camp or the Promite camp. I am in the Promite camp.
Oh, goodness.
I might post that on Facebook as a photo of 2 of them and just see what people prefer. You
should have a poll about that one.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that Vegemite might sneak past Promite, but it'll be interesting to see.
Oh, I've got all my American friends addicted to Promite.
Ah.
Yeah, when I give them Promite, they go, my God, this is good. Because they just thought they were all the same, but no.
And what are your views on the English version, Marmite?
Oh, Marmite's in between. Marmite's like a non-alcoholic version of Vegemite.
I like that explanation.
Yeah, and so as a kid, I had Marmite because my next door neighbours always had Marmite, or I'd have Promite. Vegemite didn't work for me.
Ah, so it's a whole world that I need to get into, isn't it? Really?
Oh, definitely 100%. So, one final tip from you. A younger podiatrist or someone might just be graduating or they've been out for a couple of years. What's one tip you would give them in this whole area of wound care that you'd like to finish with?
I think the tip is with wound care is it's not black and white. And I think that everybody thinks, I have to do this or it will be catastrophic. There are a few things that you can do to a wound that could be catastrophic, like, I don't know, if somebody's got no circulation and you do a massive aggressive debridement and then put compression bandaging on them, that probably will end not very well.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, I find that people are kind of mithering about things that are quite irrelevant. You know, there might be 2 different foam dressings that people are arguing the toss about. Well, it's probably not going to make that much difference to your patient whether they have A or B in that situation. So I think that you need to do a really comprehensive wound assessment, and then you need to set yourself on a course of action and don't have this constant self-doubt. If you've done your assessment properly, just put something on. Wounds don't heal quickly. Just keep reevaluating it and don't keep second guessing yourself. Obviously, if things aren't going right, then you need to change your course of action. But I think a lot of people just lack confidence. So I think you need to back yourself. And remember that it is a clinical decision that you could ask 4 different experts about the same wound and you would get 4 different answers, but they're probably all right.
That is a fantastic way to wrap up. So, Frances, I want to thank you for coming on the Podiatry Legends podcast, sharing some of your story and some of your knowledge. Oh, if people want to connect with you in any way, what is the best way of reaching out to you?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn, Frances Henshaw, or frances.henshaw@convatec.com. I would be delighted to talk to anybody.
That is fantastic. So, Frances, thank you very much for coming on the Podiatry Legends podcast.
Thanks for having me.